Thanks so much for being here today. I'm Gaia. I'm a PM on the OneDrive team working on the sync client. And today I'm going to talk to you about how we measure sync health and reliability. Here's an overview of what we're going to cover today. First, I'll walk you through how we've been framing our efforts around sync fundamentals. Then we'll go into how we measure reliability and health for the sync client and how we've evolved that over the past year. And finally, we'll close with how we're using the sync health data and what's coming next in this area. And before I get started, just a show of hands, how many of you have already deployed the sync client in the organization? Okay, so basically everyone. Awesome. So our goal has always been for the sync client to just work and to provide an experience that delights all of our end users. And with the introduction of with features like files on demand and the known folder move, that has become even more critical. For example, with files on demand, the OneDrive sync client is in the file open path. And so as your users double click on a file that's available only online, the sync client needs to work flawlessly. Same thing with known folder move. Now all of your users are saving files to their known folders where they're familiar and used to saving their files. And again, they're dependent on the OneDrive sync client to sync all those files to the cloud. And so fundamentals is critical. And so last year, we decided to double down even further with our efforts on fundamentals. And we decided to frame our work across 4 main pillars. First is performance. Performance is all about making sure our sync client is the fastest on the market and across all key scenarios. This includes full file uploads and downloads. So for example, when a user adds a new file to their OneDrive, as well as edits. And so you saw yesterday, Jason demoed DiskSync. File edits have been a key focus for us in the past recently, and we're really excited to roll out that feature. Next is scalability, and that goes hand in hand with performance. And it's really about making sure the sync client works on all supported devices and across library sizes. We've heard from a lot of you that you're having more and more files in both OneDrive and document libraries. And so we know that us having the sync client scale to large numbers of files is a key important feature and functionality for us. Next is resilience. And this one is really going back to this notion of the sync client just works. And when there are failures, we handle them gracefully. And so for example, the failures can happen in the operating system, in the apps we depend on, like Office, in the services we depend on. And even if they're rare, we need to make sure when they do happen, we handle them well, and we don't interrupt the user's experience with OneDrive. And finally, business essentials. This one is all about making sure sync works flawlessly, especially around some of the more complex features and scenarios that are available with business sync, both with OneDrive and SharePoint team sites. And so this is the framing we introduced last year around our efforts in the fundamental space. And as part of that, we were thinking, well, how do we measure success in this area? And what is our approach to measuring reliability and health? And so the rest of this talk, I'm going to cover how we've evolved our thinking there. And if we think about really the goal around these 4 pillars and around the sync fundamentals space, it's really about delighting everyone with the most reliable, performant, and scalable sync client on the market. And so everything really revolves around that and making sure we have an amazing user experience. Now first, reliability. Within the product, across the different layers, whether it's in the file system, the sync client, the services we depend on, we have hundreds and thousands of metrics instrumented across all subcomponents and scenarios that allow our engineering teams to really have great insight into the reliability of all those different parts within the system. And so in addition to being able to look at them through dashboards like the one I have here, we also have the ability to query the underlying data for more complex analysis. But the most powerful part is this notion of automated monitoring, where we can monitor the reliability data, and if there's any anomalies, we can create alerts that will tell us that we need to go investigate something. And so that's a key part of how we measure reliability, is making sure we have alerting in place that tells us when there's let's say a spike or a drop in one of our metrics. And just to walk you through an example of how alerting and monitoring can be super powerful, I'll walk you through how we use this as part of our release process. So if you've deployed OneDrive in the organization, you might know that we have 3 external rings for the sync client. So we have the insiders ring, which is meant for early adopters, and we actually recommend a lot of you be part of that because you'll get features and builds early on. Then we have the production ring, which is the default and is recommended for all users. And then we have the enterprise ring, which some organizations opt into if they want a slower release cadence. And so for this example, let's just consider the insiders and production ring. Now, we have a new build, let's say that we've deployed internally to our Microsoft rings, all the quality gates passed, everything's looking good from a reliability and health perspective, and so we're ready to deploy that to the insiders ring. Now, the first thing we'll do is deploy that to 10% insiders. And here we have actual monitors, the monitors I mentioned earlier, configured to look at just the population of users that we deployed the build to. And that really allows us to detect and receive alerts if there's any issues that were specific to the rollout of the build. And so that's super helpful when we roll out a build through our rings and make sure that we do that in a safe and staged way. And so in this case, let's say we deploy a build to 10% of our insiders ring. We have monitors, as I mentioned, looking at just that light blue part of the population. And then we have automated workflows in place that look, was there any alert that was created that detected a drop in some of our reliability metrics for that population? And if not, then we can move forward with the deployment. And so in this case, let's assume there were no alerts created, so we can move forward with the rest of the insiders ring, and then we'll do the same, we'll repeat the same process from the insiders ring to production and across the different stages of production. And so that's just one example of where alerting and monitoring all of our reliability data is critical in how we operate the service and the sync client in this case. Next, let's talk about health. And before I jump into that, I wanted to cover some of the basics of how syncing files works, just so that it's easier to explain some of the later concepts. So if you think about this, the sync client and the experience of syncing files, there's 3 main layers that are involved. There's the cloud, which is, depending on where you're syncing, OneDrive or team site document libraries. Then there's the sync client itself, and then there's the file system, which can be either Mac or Windows. And one key scenario that I wanted to walk through is adding a new file. So for example, let's say I add a new file. You can see that's represented with the blue box in the file system. Now what happens there is the file system will detect that there's a new file. It'll tell the sync client that a new file was added. We'll look for the file and upload it to the cloud, and then add it to our local store or database where we keep track of all the files to help us sync them. And so you can see the file started from the file system, and then it replicated to the state that we have in the sync client itself, and then to the cloud, which let's say in this case is a user's OneDrive. And so a scenario where this would happen is, let's say I have the known folder move feature turned on. I have a PDF file. I save that to my documents folder. And so we will pick up in this mechanism the file, and then that'll make it up to the service. Next, let's look at a case of where a file is added directly to the cloud. Now, an example of this might be, let's say last night I was at dinner. I took a scan copy of my receipt from dinner, and so I upload that through the mobile app. And so that'll go first to the cloud, and then when I turn on my laptop this morning, I was syncing that folder, and so it has to make it down to the sync client and down to the file system. And so in that case, the file starts once it gets uploaded from the mobile device to the cloud. Then the cloud will notify the sync client of a change that happened. We'll ask for more information about what changes happened since we last asked. And then in this case, it's just that one file that I have there as the blue box. And then we'll download the file to disk and add it to our local metadata store so that we know about it and keep track of it. And so at a super high level, of course I'm super simplifying everything, this is how sync works for new files. And you can assume for edits of files it's similar and slightly tweaked version of this. Now, if we think about health, the way we've measured that in the past is this notion of convergence, which is really about measuring whether or not the state of those 3 layers that I talked about are in sync and match. And so in the past, we've used that as the main health indicator, in addition to all the reliability metrics that I mentioned earlier, as the way to detect, is the sync client healthy? And so to do that, we run a periodic audit where we check, does the state of the cloud, the sync client, and the file system match? And if so, we say the state matches, so the device is converged or it's healthy. And if it doesn't match, then the state is diverged, and it means it's unhealthy. And this is super helpful because it does measure whether or not the files are in sync. And the vast majority, of course, of devices are converged, but we find it helpful to look at the cases where they're not so we can investigate what's going on. And just to give you some examples, in this case, let's say I'm syncing 5 files, just for simplicity. And in this case, they all match in state across all 3 layers. And so in this case, the device is converged, so it's healthy. In this next example, let's say I added that PDF to my documents folder, and for some reason, we didn't receive the notification from the file system about that new file. And so the sync client doesn't know about the file, and it therefore hasn't uploaded it to the cloud. And so in that case, we say the device is diverged or unhealthy. Similar, let's say the file, in the second example, I added the file from my mobile client. It was added directly to the cloud, and then for some reason, we didn't receive a notification about it. And so we didn't replicate it to disk. And so in that case, if we run our audit, it would say that the device is diverged, and so unhealthy. And so this has been our approach to measuring health in the past. And it's definitely a critical measurement. But one thing we realized as we were reframing our work around fundamentals and across the 4 pillars I mentioned earlier is the fact that while it's a helpful measurement, it doesn't capture all types of problems that a user might encounter with a sync client. And of course, these are edge cases and they're rare, and we've made a ton of improvements. But there are some issues that happen, and you might have heard from some of your users about them. And so we thought it was critical to make sure that we had a measurement of health that encompassed all of these issues and was really representative of the user's experience. And so some examples of these might be the icons in File Explorer or Finder not matching for folders when all the files are in sync. I see some nods. And so we think we need to capture this because it might be confusing to a user, are my files in sync or not? And so that's something we wanted to capture. Another example is we make requests to the service to generate rich thumbnails based on our over 300 previewers. But in some cases, let's say the request to generate the thumbnail fails for some reason. In that case, we will default back to the default thumbnail icon. And if a user is trying to distinguish between files, it's not as helpful as actually having the rich thumbnail. And so again, we wanted to factor this in as a problem as well. Also, there's different cases that will cause the sync client to be in this state where it's processing changes. And we've done a bunch of work to reduce those cases, and also in cases where it's actionable to the user, like they need to close a file so that because there's a lock on it, so they have to close it so we can sync it. We've done some work there, but we wanted to make sure we captured cases where this is still happening more than expected as a problem. And there's other types of problems as well that you may or may not have run into. For example, the one on the far right, if there's a file that has an illegal file name, today we show an error to the user because we want to notify them that they need to change the name to make it sync. And so the high level was we realized that while convergence is critical, there were other problems that might surface to our users that we want to make sure to capture. The other thing we realized is that not all of these problems have the same impact. So for example, the icon's status is not as impactful as, for example, if the sync client is crashing and the user can't use it at all. And so we wanted to make sure we had a way, as we were rethinking how we measure health, to factor in the impact of the problem. And so if a problem has a lower impact, then it has a lower weight, and a higher impact has a higher weight. And so these are just some examples, but the key takeaways for us were, A, we want to measure more than convergence and really have an end-user-focused view of health, and B, we want to make sure if there's different types of problems, we weight them differently based on the impact to the end user. And so that led us to the introduction of the device health score, which is basically a score that we calculate for every device that's signed in, that's based on whichever problem buckets, if any, they ran into, and the associated impact weight, or how bad of a problem it was. Now, of course, most of our users have a health score of 0, which means that they're healthy, but we wanted to make sure we capture the ones that are unhealthy so we can go investigate. And so the client will keep track of the types of issues or problem buckets that happen in the past 24 hours, and we'll report those up to our service. And as I mentioned, if the health score is 0, that means no problems occurred, so the device is healthy. If there were one or more problems, then the device is unhealthy, and that's something we would want to investigate. And the magnitude of the score allows us to compare different devices and understand the difference between them and the types of problems they're experiencing. Now, let's look through an example really quick. So let's say bucket A is actually convergence, which we talked about a bunch earlier. It's really about measuring whether or not the state across all 3 layers matches. And now let's say we introduce buckets B through F, which represent some of the other problems that I showed on the screenshot earlier. And so we keep track of those for every device that's signed in for the last 24 hours. And in this case, like the vast majority of our sync clients in the wild, they're all 0, and so the device is healthy, which is great. Next, let's look at an example where this device actually had 1 convergence issue we detected, and also had 2 instances of problem bucket E, which let's say in this case is one of those red X errors caused by an illegal file name. In this case, the device is unhealthy because it has a health score that's greater than 0. And now you might be wondering, well, it's awesome that you're measuring this, but how are you actually using it? And so the first thing that this has been really helpful is to really help us understand the health of the sync client across different segments of the user population. So for example, we can look at the health across Windows and Mac, across personal and business sync, across different features and whether they're turned on and turned off. So as an example, we're in the process of rolling out the per machine sync client, which is currently in public preview. And so as an example, we can look at the health score for people running the per machine client and people running the per user client to see, are there any specific issues that we might have missed as part of that feature rollout. And so that really helps us make sure that we're rolling out features in a safe way and that we know if there's any issues that we need to go investigate. And the other example of an interesting pivot is based on usage patterns. So for example, we can look at the health score and the problem buckets of users syncing large libraries versus the baseline as a way to see, are there any types of issues that are specific to that usage pattern of many files? And if so, what are they and how do we investigate them? And so being able to segment across the population has been really helpful to us with this health metric. And really, then, what that allows us to do is make sure we prioritize our engineering investments in the fundamentals space based on the information that we gather with this data. So for example, and also measure the impact. So for example, if we decide we're going to go after a certain class of problems, then we can go make the changes to improve those, and then we can measure the impact of those changes afterwards. And finally, the other thing that's been really helpful is the sync health metric allows us to get more insight into the health of an overall organization. For example, when we work closely with certain organizations, either as part of an issue that comes to our engineering team or as part of working closely with certain organizations through their migration, it allows us to see what's going on from a sync client perspective and what types of issues, if any, are the users facing. And so that's been also really helpful. And next, I'm going to talk to you about what's coming. And so first, we're going to continue to drive the work to drive down the buckets of problems and use that to really prioritize the engineering investments. So again, we've been making a ton of progress, but we still have work to do. And so we'll continue to use this as a way to drive what we prioritize in our backlogs. Next, we're going to continue to fill in and really refine this metric. And that takes there's two approaches there. One is making sure if there's types of issues that we aren't currently capturing that users might run into, we want to make sure those are captured so we have a comprehensive view of the health. And secondly, we also want to make sure if there are types of issues that we're currently reporting as problems, but they're not user impacting, then those false positives we want to remove from the health score so that it's a better signal of our users' experience. And the last part is really thinking about how we start to make some of these problems, especially the ones that are actionable to you and you can follow up with your users, and how we can make that more self-service. And we know that's been a key request from a lot of you, and so that's kind of the next evolution of some of the work I mentioned, is how do we take some of the problem types that are actionable and surface them to all of you. And I'll close with, I started talking about our work in the sync fundamentals space. And so the work I talked about with health and reliability was part of that. And a lot of the work we do is really more under the covers. But here's just a quick overview of some of the features that we've been working on and are rolling out with our sync fundamentals work. So for example, you can see available now, we've shipped support for some of the URL changes like UPN changes and site geomoves. We also shipped with the preview of site URL changes, the sync client will recover automatically without your users having to unlink and relink their OneDrive. We shipped several improvements, for example, to CPU and memory usage for setup and update, which we know is critical. And then we've been working on including ways for users to resolve problems within the product. So for example, I mentioned the illegal file and folder names. We're in the process of rolling out an experience that will make it easier for users to fix those in bulk and get out of that state. And diff sync, you already saw it's coming later this year. That will be critical for performance and also to reduce network utilization. We're also working on some smarter bandwidth management controls that will help for both uploads and downloads, which we know has been a key request from a lot of you. And then we're also working on a new error experience that will make it easier for users to understand the types of issues if they occur, and it'll be standardized across Mac and Windows, and it'll make it easier for them to figure out how to resolve those issues. And then top of mind, I mentioned we're thinking about how do we make this information self-service to you so that you can then go follow up where it makes sense with your users. Thank you so much. And I'll be around for questions at the end. And I have Andre here, who works with me on Sync Fundamentals, is also in the room. So thank you so much.